This audiobook reveals the secret code to the universe, hidden in the way you speak to yourself. As you listen, you'll uncover the truth. Talk to yourself like a king, and the universe will give you everything you want. The time has come to speak it into existence tonight. Introduction. There is a code, spoken not to others but to yourself, in the quiet and private language you use when no one else is listening, and this code, more than any other force at work in your life, has been quietly writing the terms by which the universe answers you. You have never been taught to notice it. No teacher ever sat you down in your childhood and asked you to listen carefully to the words you speak to yourself in the solitary hours of your day, the small and constant narration running beneath every action you take, every decision you weigh, every quiet moment you spend simply existing within the private chambers of your own mind. And yet, this inner voice, left entirely unchecked and unexamined across the whole span of your life, has been shaping your circumstances long before any outward action was ever taken to earn them, long before any word was ever spoken aloud to another living soul. There exists a profound and generally unexamined difference between the tone of a servant and the tone of a king. Not a difference of title, not a difference of wealth, or station, or birth, but a difference of private inner address, spoken quietly to oneself in the moments no one else will ever hear or witness. The servant speaks to himself in doubt, in apology, in smallness, qualifying his own hopes before he has even finished stating them, diminishing his own worth as casually and as habitually as he might mention the weather passing overhead. The king speaks to himself in calm, assured command, stating what he intends without flinching, without apologizing, without waiting for permission from any voice but his own settled and sovereign judgment. This single difference in inner tone, cultivated quietly across years without either man ever naming it directly or examining it consciously, produces two entirely different relationships with the unseen forces that govern circumstance, and two entirely different lives as a direct result of that difference. This is not, and has never truly been, a matter of birth or fortune. A man born into genuine and considerable poverty may speak to himself, in the deep privacy of his own mind, with the calm and settled authority of a king who has never once doubted his own worth, while a man born into significant inherited wealth may speak to himself, in that very same privacy, with the anxious and apologetic tone of a servant who never truly believes himself worthy of what he already, and quite visibly, possesses. It is the tone, and the tone alone, that the universe faithfully and consistently answers, not the title stamped upon a birth certificate, not the balance recorded in a ledger, not the opinion held by neighbors or strangers, passing judgment from the outside. What follows in these pages is the uncovering of an ancient and quietly guarded discipline of self-address, a discipline once known, in one form or another, to a rare few throughout the long span of history who understood, whether or not they could ever have explained it in these exact and careful words, that the voice used in private shapes, with remarkable and consistent fidelity, the world eventually received in public. You will be shown, across the teachings that follow, how to listen honestly, and without flinching to the voice you have been using all along, how to trace its true origins back to those who first taught it to you without ever asking your consent, and how to gradually and deliberately replace it with the calm, commanding tone of one who expects, quite simply and without arrogance, to be obeyed by the circumstances of their own life. This transformation will not happen through sheer force of will, and it will not happen through pretending to feel something you do not yet genuinely feel within yourself. It will happen, instead, through patient and repeated practice, spoken quietly to yourself in the private hours when no one else can hear you, until the new and chosen tone becomes as natural to you, in time, as the old and inherited one once was. Notice, for perhaps the very first time in your entire life, the way you have been speaking to yourself all along, in every quiet and unremarked moment of your existence. Enter this teaching now with humility and full and undivided attention, setting aside whatever old assumptions you may have long carried about your own worth or your own rightful place in the world. For what follows will ask you to examine something you have perhaps never before thought to examine so closely or so honestly. The deeper instruction of Part 1 awaits you now, ready to begin the moment you are ready to listen. Act 1. The Code Hidden in Your Own Voice. Chapter 1. The Words No One Taught You to Notice. Everett Calloway worked as a clerk in a modest counting house near the harbour, keeping careful columns of figures through long and largely unremarkable days, and had never once, in all his years of quiet and diligent labour, thought to examine the words he spoke silently to himself as he moved through those days from morning until evening. An old mentor of his, a retired accountant, who had taken a kindly and rather fatherly interest in the young man's career, suggested to him one afternoon, almost in passing over a cup of tea, that he might spend a single week simply listening, not changing anything just yet, not correcting anything, merely listening with real attention to the private and nearly constant narration running beneath his every action throughout each day. Everett agreed to the small experiment, more out of politeness toward his mentor than any genuine curiosity of his own, and began that very evening to pay careful attention to what he had never before thought worth noticing. He was startled, within the very first day alone, by how frequently his own inner voice offered him small and dismissive judgments he would never, in 100 years, have spoken aloud to another living soul. However unkind that other soul might have been toward him, that was a foolish thing to say just now. You should have known better than that. No wonder they overlooked you again for the promotion you wanted. By the close of the week, he had filled several pages of a private notebook with phrases he was, in genuine and quiet truth, rather ashamed to discover belonged so thoroughly and so consistently to him, small, doubtful, and dismissive words, repeated so many hundreds of times across a single, ordinary week, that he could hardly credit the sheer and exhausting volume of it once he saw it laid out plainly before him on the page. This silent inner speech, repeated many hundreds of times daily, and almost entirely unnoticed by the very one speaking it into being, forms the true and continuous code by which a person's life is quietly and steadily written, far outweighing in genuine influence any words spoken aloud to others across that very same span of time. Most people go their entire lives never once pausing to examine this constant inner narration, assuming, without ever once testing the assumption against real evidence, that their private thoughts are simply neutral background noise, entirely unconnected to the circumstances that eventually arrive, season after season, to meet them. Millicent Rowe, a seamstress working not far from Everett's own quiet counting house, began keeping a small private tally of her own self-directed words over the course of a single ordinary afternoon, marking a small tick in the margin of her notebook each time she caught herself speaking critically to herself in the privacy of her own busy mind while she worked at her needle. She was genuinely astonished by the time evening finally arrived, and she set down her work to count far more phrases of quiet and habitual self-criticism than she ever would have guessed beforehand, having always considered herself, by her own honest and long-held estimation, a reasonably kind and patient woman, kind and patient, she now realized with some discomfort, to everyone in her life, except, apparently, herself. Imagine, honestly and without any harsh judgment of yourself for what you might discover, What such a tally of your own recent inner speech might reveal about the code you have unknowingly been writing across the whole of your own life, spoken so quietly and so constantly, day after unremarked day, that you never once thought to listen closely to what it was actually and continuously saying to you. Practice. Tonight, spend a portion of your evening simply observing, without attempting to change anything just yet, the words you speak silently to yourself as you move through your ordinary tasks. Notice them exactly as Everett and Millicent learned to notice theirs, preparing yourself gently and honestly for the deeper work that follows in the chapters ahead. Chapter 2. Why Kings Speak Differently Than Servants. Lucius and Barnabas Thorne were raised in the very same modest household, by the very same parents, under the very same ordinary circumstances of upbringing, and yet grew, across their shared childhood and into their separate adult lives, into two entirely different manners of inner address that neither brother could have fully explained even to himself if pressed to try. Lucius habitually apologized, in the deep privacy of his own mind, even for his own simple presence in a room full of others, a quiet and constant undercurrent of sorry to trouble you, sorry to take up space here, sorry to have an opinion worth voicing at all running beneath nearly everything he did or said throughout his ordinary days. Barnabas, by some difference in temperament or early formative experience that neither brother could ever clearly trace back to its true source, had somehow cultivated the very opposite habit, quietly and instinctively, assuming his own rightful place in any gathering without a second thought, crossing his mind, speaking to himself, when he spoke to himself at all, in the calm and settled tone of one who simply and naturally belonged wherever he happened to find himself. These two entirely different inner tones, cultivated separately and largely unconsciously over many years of otherwise remarkably similar upbringing, eventually produced two very different lives for the two brothers as they grew into their separate adulthoods. Lucius forever hovering uncertainly at the edges of opportunity, apologizing his own way through circumstances that might otherwise have favored him considerably, Barnabas moving through the wider world with an ease and a warm welcome that seemed, to outside observers who never knew the private cause of it, almost effortless and entirely natural to him, though neither brother could ever have named the true reason why their paths had diverged so completely. The true difference between the tone of a servant and the tone of a king has little to do, in the end, with actual title, wealth, or outward circumstance of any kind, and everything to do with the quiet, private manner in which each man addresses his own self when no one else in the world is listening, a manner the outside world, in time and through means not always easy to trace with precision, eventually comes to mirror back with remarkable and rather startling faithfulness. Dorothea Pratt, a shop assistant of modest means working long hours behind a modest counter, began deliberately experimenting one particular season with speaking to herself in the calm, assured tone she imagined a queen might use, even while performing the most ordinary and entirely unremarkable daily tasks that filled her working hours, folding cloth carefully, greeting customers politely, tallying the day's modest receipts each evening. She noticed, to her own quiet and genuine surprise, that others in the shop began treating her, within a matter of just a few short weeks, with a new and rather unexplained deference she had never once before experienced in all her years of working there, as though her own private and unspoken tone had somehow become audible to those around her, despite never once being spoken aloud for anyone else to hear. Honestly, and without judgment, but with full and genuine clarity, place your own habitual inner tone somewhere along this same spectrum, stretching between the apologizing servant and the assured and settled king, and consider carefully what that particular placement may already be quietly shaping in the whole of your own life. Practice. For a short stretch of today, experiment with speaking to yourself in the deliberately calm and assured tone of royalty, entirely regardless of your outward circumstances in that particular moment, and notice what shifts, however subtly or however quietly, within you as you do this small experiment. Chapter 3. The Universe as a Faithful Translator. Herbert Kane worked as a young translator at a busy and cosmopolitan trading port, rendering the spoken words of merchants and travelers from a dozen different tongues into language their trading partners could readily understand, and took considerable and genuine pride in rendering every single phrase exactly as it was spoken to him, without softening a harsh demand, without exaggerating a modest request, without ever once judging the words passed carefully through him. However foolish or however grand they happened to sound in their original and unfamiliar tongue, he came, over many long years of this careful and scrupulously neutral labor, to understand his own quiet professional role as something of a living parable for a far larger and mostly unseen process constantly at work in every single human life around him. The universe itself behaves not as a judge weighing the worthiness of what is spoken inwardly, deciding by some hidden standard which requests deserve favor and which deserve denial, but as a faithful and entirely neutral translator, rendering whatever tone and content is most consistently offered to it into the perfectly matching language of outward circumstance, without any preference whatsoever for grandeur over humility, or for worthiness over unworthiness as judged by any outside standard. It simply translates, faithfully and without editorial comment of any kind, exactly what it has been given most often and most consistently over time. Agnes Whitmore spent many long and rather weary years believing the universe had simply decided, for reasons entirely beyond her own understanding or her own control, to withhold good fortune from her specifically and deliberately, as though she had somehow been singled out by some vast and cosmic unfairness she could never quite name or explain to herself. It was only much later in her life, after considerable and rather painful private reflection on the matter, that she finally recognized the universe had instead been faithfully translating, this whole time and without any malice whatsoever, the very same small and apologetic inner speech she had been offering it, quite unconsciously, for decades upon decades, a translator rendering exactly and precisely what it had been given, nothing more and nothing less than that. Release any lingering belief you may still privately carry that the universe judges or selectively favors certain people over others, deciding by some hidden and arbitrary standard who genuinely deserves abundance and who does not, and consider instead what it may simply have been faithfully translating from your own private inner code all along, entirely without judgment either way. Practice. Tonight, consider one recurring circumstance in your own life and the inner phrase it may have been faithfully translated from, tracing the outward and visible pattern back carefully to its likely private and inward origin. Chapter 4. The Servant's Tongue and What It Costs. Beatrice Hollingsworth possessed genuine and considerable skill as a seamstress, admired quietly and sincerely by those discerning few who saw her very finest work up close, and yet constantly referred to herself, in the deep privacy of her own thoughts, as merely adequate, merely lucky to have any customers at all coming through her door, merely getting by from one modest season to the next, without any real distinction. Over the course of many quiet and slowly passing years, she slowly came to recognize, with a kind of weary and rather belated clarity that arrived only after much reflection, that her business had never once grown beyond exactly the modest scale those very words of hers described so precisely, as though her own private language had drawn some invisible but entirely real boundary around what she was ever permitted to become. Habitually speaking to oneself, as though beneath one's own true and genuine circumstances, does not merely describe a present limitation accurately, the way an honest and neutral accounting might simply record a fact. It actively instructs the universe to continue enforcing that very same limitation, keeping the speaker faithfully and precisely where their own careless words have quietly and steadily placed them, season after unchanging season of their life. Reginald Ashby, a shopkeeper working in the very same modest town as Beatrice, caught himself referring to his own small establishment as just a little shop, nothing special, so very often, both in casual conversation with his customers and in the privacy of his own passing thoughts alike, that customers themselves eventually began echoing this very same diminishing language directly back to him, describing his shop in nearly identical terms, without ever once having heard him say any such thing directly to them, as though his own private and unspoken code had somehow become audible through the very atmosphere of the place itself. Consider what habitual diminishing phrases you yourself may be using about your own life, your own work, or your own genuine worth, and what such careless phrases may have been quietly costing you across however many years you have now been repeating them without ever once examining them closely. Practice. Tonight, identify one habitual diminishing phrase you commonly use about yourself and consciously set it aside for the remainder of this very day, noticing what small shift, if any, this brief and deliberate absence produces within you. Chapter 5. Discovering the Voice You Never Chose. Walter Grimsby, a young telegraph operator of careful and reflective temperament, sat quietly by himself one evening turning over his own harshest inner criticism, examining it far more closely than he ever had before in his life, and recognized with a genuine start of surprise that its exact cadence and its exact and particular choice of words belonged not truly to himself at all, but rather to a stern uncle who had helped raise him many years before a voice he had unknowingly absorbed whole, entirely, in his own childhood, and continued repeating faithfully to himself for decades afterward, without ever once questioning where it had originally and truly come from. Much of a person's habitual inner speech was never truly chosen at all, in any meaningful or deliberate sense, but rather inherited wholesale from parents, teachers, and early authority figures during years far too young to critically examine, question, or reject what was quietly being absorbed at the time. Recognizing this simple but often entirely overlooked inheritance is the necessary and essential first step before any deliberate new code can be spoken sincerely in its rightful place. Priscilla Notting traced her own persistent inner refrain of "you'll never be good enough" back through careful and patient private reflection to a single offhand remark made by a schoolteacher many decades before her present life, a remark the teacher herself had almost certainly forgotten within the very hour of speaking it aloud, and yet which had shaped, quite invisibly and quite thoroughly, so many long years of Priscilla's own private inner speech ever since. She was genuinely astonished. Once she traced it all the way back to its small and now largely forgotten origin, that so tiny and fleeting a moment could have grown into something so large and so persistently limiting within her own private mind. Consider whose voice you may actually be hearing when you speak harshly to yourself in the privacy of your own thoughts, and whether that particular voice was ever truly yours to keep and carry forward, or whether, like Walter's and like Priscilla's, it was simply handed to you long before you ever had any real say in the matter at all. Practice. Tonight, trace one habitual harsh inner phrase of your own back to its likely true origin and consciously release it as not truly your own possession, offering yourself, in its rightful place, the freedom to speak to yourself quite differently from now on. Chapter 6. The First Utterance of the Code. Solomon Peabody, a young inventor who had spent many long years quietly disparaging his own promising ideas before he ever thought to share a single one of them with anyone else, one particular evening deliberately spoke a single new sentence to himself, alone in his cluttered workshop, with as much genuine sincerity as he could manage to summon. "I am a man whose ideas matter." He noticed, with some real and genuine surprise, a subtle but entirely unmistakable shift in his own posture and his own quiet confidence that very same night, as though the sentence itself had settled something important within him that years of quiet self-disparagement had left entirely unsettled until that moment. The code does not require years of gradual and patient practice before it begins working in any meaningful or noticeable way. It begins, in genuine truth, the very moment even a single sentence is spoken to oneself, exactly as a king would choose to speak it deliberately, calmly, and entirely without the habitual qualifiers of doubt that so often and so quickly follow such bold statements when they are spoken carelessly or half-heartedly. Harriet Coswell attempted this very same exercise one evening of her own, speaking a similarly hopeful sentence to herself with real intention, but immediately undercut it with a muttered, "Though who am I kidding?" really, trailing closely and quietly behind it, and noticed no meaningful shift whatsoever. As a direct result, a clear and rather instructive illustration of how easily the first utterance of the code can be entirely undone by an old and deeply familiar habit, trailing closely behind it before it has any chance to take root. Consider the real and considerable power available in even one clean and entirely unqualified sentence spoken to yourself in the calm tone of royalty, without any doubting phrase permitted to follow closely behind it and quietly undo its intended effect. Practice. Right now, in this very moment, speak one single sentence to yourself in the calm and unqualified tone of a king, without any doubting phrase allowed to follow it, holding the resulting silence afterward, rather than rushing to fill it with old and familiar habit. Chapter 7. Command, not complaint. Frederick Lowry, a modest clerk of unremarkable standing in his own small office, spent his mornings complaining privately and habitually to himself about his circumstances, his employer, and his generally limited prospects for advancement, rehearsing his many grievances quietly in the privacy of his own mind as he walked the familiar route to work each and every day. One day, at the quiet and gentle suggestion of an old friend who had noticed this habitual pattern of complaint in him, he began instead simply stating, calmly and entirely without complaint, exactly what he intended his coming day to hold for him, not a wish, not a distant hope, but a simple and unadorned statement of clear intention. A king does not complain to the universe about what is currently lacking in his circumstances, for complaint itself is simply a form of request repeated endlessly in the very language of lack and scarcity, reinforcing through constant repetition the very absence it claims, on its surface, to genuinely lament. He instead commands calmly and entirely without doubt, stating clearly and simply what is intended, rather than dwelling at any length whatsoever on what happens at present to be absent from his life. Clarissa Dunmore caught herself complaining bitterly each and every evening about her own persistent lack of opportunity, rehearsing the very same familiar grievance night after night without variation, and experimented instead with calmly declaring, in its place, "Opportunity finds me easily and often," noticing, within a matter of just a few weeks, a marked and rather welcome change, not only in her own private mood, but in time, in the actual and tangible opportunities that slowly began appearing in her ordinary life. Examine your own recent inner speech honestly and carefully for patterns of habitual complaint, and consider replacing that complaint deliberately with calm and confident command instead. Practice. Tonight, identify one habitual complaint you commonly carry and rewrite it as a calm, confident command, speaking the new version aloud to yourself with genuine and settled conviction. Chapter 8. The Difference Between Begging and Declaring. Nathaniel Sparrow, a young farmer of anxious and rather worried temperament, spent his evenings pleading fervently and anxiously with fate for a good harvest to come, wringing his hands over soil and weather entirely beyond his own control or influence, until an old and patient neighbor, watching this nightly ritual of anxious pleading with some genuine sympathy, taught him instead to simply and calmly declare, each and every evening without fail, that his fields were already blessed with genuine abundance, not offered as a wish, but stated plainly as a settled and quiet fact already true. There exists a real and rather consequential difference between begging, which carries within it the very feeling of lack it hopes so desperately to overcome, and declaring, which carries instead the calm and settled assumption of already having what is desired. Declaring draws forth what begging so often and so painfully tends to repel, for begging signals scarcity to the listening universe, while declaring signals settled and confident possession. Isadora Fenn noticed herself pleading anxiously each night for a difficult situation in her own private life to finally and fully resolve itself, and experimented instead with replacing this anxious pleading with a single calm declaration in its place, a brief statement, spoken once with conviction, and then released entirely, finding the anxious grip of the whole situation loosening considerably in the days that followed her simple and deliberate change of approach. Consider where in your own life you may have been begging rather than declaring, pleading anxiously with circumstance rather than calmly assuming what you genuinely wish to be true. Practice. Tonight, transform one anxious, pleading thought of your own into a single calm declaration, speaking it once with quiet conviction rather than repeating it anxiously many times over. Chapter 9. Your Inner Court and Who Sits on It. Josephine Atwater realized, upon careful and rather honest reflection one quiet evening alone, that her private thoughts were often shaped as though several old, familiar, and rather discouraging voices from her past sat permanently seated around her in some private inner chamber, offering constant and unsolicited advice. She had never once thought to question the actual right of them to give a parent's old warning repeated endlessly, a teacher's old doubt never forgotten, a rival's old dismissal still somehow relevant, all of them still quietly advising her private decisions decades after they were first originally spoken to her. Every person carries, whether or not they have ever once thought to examine it closely, an inner court of their own, the collection of remembered voices, past authority figures, and old and lingering fears that they unknowingly allow to advise their private thoughts on a daily basis. A true king carefully and quite deliberately chooses who is permitted to sit upon this inner court of his, and dismisses without hesitation any voice that no longer genuinely serves him well, regardless of how long that particular voice may have already occupied its comfortable seat. Barnaby Holt identified one particular discouraging voice from his own youth that continued to comment, entirely uninvited, on nearly every decision he made as a grown adult, and deliberately imagined dismissing this particular voice from his own inner court entirely, picturing the act quite vividly and with real intention, and noticed a new and genuinely welcome lightness in his own private deliberations in the weeks that followed this small but deliberate act. Consider which voices currently sit upon your own inner court, and whether each one, honestly and carefully examined, still truly deserves the seat it has quietly occupied for so very long. Practice. Tonight, identify one discouraging inner voice of your own, and consciously dismiss it from your inner court imagining the act clearly and with real, deliberate intention. Chapter 10. The First Royal Decree. Elias Thorne, a young blacksmith who had spent many months gradually and quite patiently correcting his own inner speech through diligent practice, one evening composed and spoke aloud to himself, in complete privacy, a single, deliberate, and fully complete decree concerning the kind of life he genuinely intended to live from that point forward, not a passing wish, but a considered and complete statement, delivered with calm and settled conviction. He felt, as he spoke it aloud into the quiet of his own workshop, an unfamiliar and deeply settled sense of authority he had never once before experienced in the whole of his life up to that moment. This first true royal decree, composed deliberately rather than spoken carelessly in some passing and unconsidered moment, and delivered with the calm certainty of one who genuinely expects to be obeyed by his own circumstances, marks the true and genuine beginning of the code taking real hold in a person's life, setting in motion a quiet current of circumstance that continues long after the words themselves have faded entirely from memory. Cyrus Bramwell, a doubting neighbor of Elias's from the same small town, listened to him describe this new and rather unusual practice with open and rather undisguised skepticism, entirely unwilling to attempt so seemingly simple an exercise himself, considering it beneath any serious consideration on his part, and continued, in the many months that followed, to live exactly as he always had before, entirely unchanged by anything he had heard described to him. Recognize that you now stand at this very same threshold that Elias once stood at himself, ready and prepared to compose and speak your own first deliberate decree. Practice. To close this first part of your journey, compose and speak, in complete privacy, your own first full and complete royal decree concerning the life you genuinely intend, from this point forward, to live. Act 2. The Sacred Practices of Speaking Like a King. Chapter 11. The Throne Room of the Mind. Homer Fairweather, a night watchman who spent long and solitary hours through the quiet darkness of his working shifts, began picturing, quite deliberately and with growing detail, a private, inner throne room within his own mind, a quiet chamber, entirely and exclusively his own, where he alone sat in full and settled authority over his own private thoughts. He found that returning to this imagined chamber each and every evening before speaking any decree of his own, lent a new and genuinely welcome steadiness to whatever he chose to decree there, as though the chamber itself lent real weight and gravity to his carefully chosen words. There is genuine and lasting value in imagining a specific inner throne room of one's own, a quiet and private mental space set deliberately apart from the noise and clutter of ordinary daily life, in which every true decree is first carefully composed and spoken before it is ever allowed to take root in ordinary thought, and eventually in visible and outward circumstance. Vera Applegate scattered her own private reflections carelessly across every noisy and distracted moment of her busy day, never once retreating to any quiet inner chamber of her own making, offering her private thoughts amid constant clutter and frequent interruption, rather than in any deliberate and chosen stillness, and found her own inner speech just as scattered and inconsistent as her outward circumstances continued to remain, season after season. Consider creating your own imagined throne room, a dedicated and private space within your own mind, reserved specifically for future decrees, set deliberately apart from the noise of your ordinary day. Practice. Tonight, imagine your own private inner throne room for the very first time, picturing it in whatever detail feels most natural and comfortable to you, and sit quietly within it for a moment before returning to the rest of your evening. Chapter 12. Speaking Before Sleep as Royalty. Augustus Hartwell, a modest clerk of quiet and steady habits, began closing each ordinary day by speaking to himself, in the quiet minutes just before sleep finally arrived, exactly as a king might address his own household before retiring for the night, calm, assured, and entirely without complaint, regardless of whatever particular difficulties the day itself had happened to hold for him. The final words spoken to oneself before sleep carry unusual and disproportionate weight, for they are received by a mind already loosened considerably from its ordinary daytime defenses, and so this closing address of the day genuinely deserves the very same royal tone given so carefully to any other decree spoken earlier. Percival Dodd, by rather telling contrast, muttered his usual anxious complaints each night before sleep finally took him, rehearsing the day's many frustrations rather than closing them out with any royal calm, and continued waking each following morning to find those same complaints faithfully and precisely confirmed by the very day that followed. Consider how you typically address yourself in these final waking moments before sleep, and what tone you may now wish to deliberately adopt instead, following the careful example Augustus set for himself. Practice. Tonight, offer yourself a brief royal address before sleep finally arrives, spoken calmly and entirely without complaint, closing your day exactly as a king might choose to close his own. Chapter 13. The Tone Beneath the Words. Josephine Carter, a schoolteacher of careful and habitual observation, noticed one otherwise ordinary afternoon that speaking the very same hopeful sentence in two entirely different tones, once hesitant and rather uncertain, once calmly and quite certainly assured, produced two entirely different feelings within her as she spoke each version aloud, and began to suspect, quite reasonably, that the tone itself carried far more genuine weight than the actual words chosen to carry it. It is the calm, certain tone beneath the words spoken far more than their precise and particular content that the universe truly and faithfully obeys, so that even ordinary and rather unremarkable words, spoken with genuine royal certainty, outweigh grand and elaborate words, spoken instead with visible hesitation. Elmer Griggs spoke elaborate and carefully composed affirmations each and every day, choosing his particular words with real and evident care, but in a tone of quiet doubt, lingering beneath them, that steadily undermined every single word he offered, and wondered, with growing frustration, why his own elaborate speech produced so remarkably little visible change in his ordinary circumstances, despite his evident and sincere effort. Examine the tone beneath your own habitual words, quite apart from the words themselves, and consider carefully whether that particular tone truly matches the genuine confidence you intend and wish to convey. Practice. Tonight, speak one simple sentence aloud in a deliberately calm and certain tone, noticing carefully the real difference this tone alone produces within you as you speak it. Chapter 14. Rewriting the Servant Sentences. Delphine Hargrove, a widow of reflective and careful temperament, catalogued over the course of a single careful week several of her most habitual inner sentences of doubt and smallness, writing each one down exactly as she caught herself thinking it during her ordinary day, and then deliberately rewrote each one into the calm and settled language of command, practicing the new versions repeatedly until they began to feel considerably more natural to her than the old and worn versions had ever felt. Identifying old servant sentences and consciously rewriting them, phrase by careful phrase, into the language a king would naturally use, is a simple discipline in basic principle, though it genuinely requires patient and repeated attention, before it fully and completely replaces the old and deeply worn pattern it is specifically meant to correct. Cornelius Beadle identified his own old sentences readily enough once he paused to listen carefully, recognizing them clearly and without much difficulty, but never actually took the time to rewrite them into any new language of his own choosing, continuing instead to speak the old versions purely from long habit, even after clearly recognizing their servile and rather diminishing tone. Consider the real and lasting value of actually rewriting, rather than merely noticing, your own old sentences, for noticing alone changes remarkably little without the further and deliberate work of genuine replacement that must follow it. Practice. Tonight, identify and rewrite one habitual servant sentence of your own into the language of royal command, speaking the new version aloud repeatedly until it settles more naturally within you. Chapter 15. The Royal I Am. Rosalind Fenwick began experimenting one particular season with completing the simple two-word phrase, I am, in new and deliberately chosen ways each and every morning, rather than allowing it to complete itself automatically and unconsciously as it always had before, and discovered that these two small and seemingly modest words, however they happened to be completed, seemed to carry unusual and rather surprising weight in shaping the tone of her entire day that followed. The phrase, I am, spoken with true and genuine conviction, forms the very heart of every decree a king has ever made throughout the whole of history, for it is the most direct and unambiguous possible statement of identity available to any speaker, and identity, once firmly and deliberately declared with real conviction, becomes the very template the universe most faithfully translates into matching and corresponding circumstance. Herbert Yancey habitually completed this same simple phrase with diminishing words such as, I am just getting by. I suppose, repeating this small and seemingly harmless completion so often and so entirely automatically that he never once paused to consider how directly and how faithfully this simple daily declaration continued to shape very circumstances he so often complained of to others. Examine how you yourself typically complete the phrase, I am, and consider carefully what new and deliberately chosen completion you might genuinely offer in its place from this day forward. Practice. Tonight, choose and speak one new, deliberately royal completion of the phrase, I am, holding it with genuine and settled conviction as you speak it aloud. Chapter 16. Silencing the Court of Doubt. Wendell Ashcroft, each and every time he attempted to speak a new decree, noticed a familiar chorus of doubtful voices immediately rising up to object within his own private mind, and learned, gradually and through patient and repeated practice, to calmly acknowledge and then simply dismiss these voices, rather than arguing with them at any real length, as he had once been strongly inclined to do in his earlier attempts. Doubtful inner voices must be calmly and deliberately dismissed from the throne room before any true decree can be fully spoken and genuinely received. For arguing at length with such persistent voices only grants them further and rather unwarranted authority over the proceedings, while calm and simple dismissal denies them any real foothold at all within the chamber. Adelaide Crum, by contrast, engaged each and every doubtful voice that arose within her in lengthy and rather exhausting internal argument, wrestling with each fresh objection in turn as it appeared, exhausting herself thoroughly each night without ever once managing to speak a truly clear and unopposed decree at all. Consider practicing calm dismissal rather than lengthy and exhausting argument the very next time doubt happens to arise within your own attempted practice. Practice. Tonight, calmly dismiss one doubtful voice before speaking your evening decree, acknowledging its presence briefly without engaging it in any further argument. Chapter 17. The Daily Ritual of the Royal Voice. Reginald Thorpe, a modest bank teller of steady and reliable habits, assembled a brief and consistent daily ritual of royal self-address for himself, practicing it faithfully each and every morning and evening without any significant variation, and noticed, over the course of many months of steady practice, his entire manner of carrying himself shifting so gradually and so quietly that he barely perceived the change within himself until it became genuinely undeniable to those around him who knew him well. It is the devoted daily repetition of this royal voice, rather than any single dramatic decree spoken once with great enthusiasm and then forgotten, that ultimately transforms the code from a passing and interesting idea into a lived and thoroughly permanent habit of mind, settled firmly and completely into the very rhythm of one's daily life. Mabel Truscott practiced her own royal voice only occasionally, and rather inconsistently, whenever she happened to remember to do so amid her busy days, taking it up with real enthusiasm for a few days before forgetting it entirely for weeks at a stretch, and found her own progress just as inconsistent as her own scattered and rather irregular practice had been. Consider the true and lasting value of daily consistency over occasional dramatic effort, however genuinely sincere that occasional burst of effort might well be. Practice. Tonight, assemble your own brief daily ritual of royal self-address, and resolve firmly to repeat it faithfully going forward from this evening. Chapter 18. Visualizing the court that obeys. Clarence Whitlock began picturing his own ordinary circumstances quite vividly and with considerable and deliberate detail as loyal subjects standing ready and eager to carry out whatever he happened to decree, imagining money, opportunity, and favorable people alike, bowing quietly and readily to his own calm and settled authority whenever he chose to speak. Picturing one's own circumstances themselves as loyal subjects awaiting one's word strengthens the authority behind each decree quite considerably, lending it a vividness and a genuine conviction that mere words alone, however carefully chosen, rarely manage to achieve entirely on their own. Sylvia Duquette spoke her own decrees faithfully enough each evening, but never once pictured anything actually responding to them in her mind's eye, leaving that important and valuable visualization entirely unimagined and unexplored, and found her own sense of personal authority remaining faint and rather uncertain as a direct result of this significant omission. Consider adding vivid and deliberate visualization to the decrees you have already begun speaking, picturing your own circumstances, responding just as loyal subjects genuinely would. Practice. Tonight, visualize your own circumstances responding obediently to one specific decree of yours, picturing this response in as much vivid and sensory detail as you can genuinely summon. Chapter 19. Gratitude as the King's Final Word. Winifred Pemberton began closing each of her own daily decrees not with anxious waiting for eventual proof, but with a brief and calm word of genuine thanks, spoken as though the matter in question were already fully settled and entirely beyond any further question or lingering doubt. A true king closes each and every decree not with pleading or with anxious hope, but with quiet and thoroughly assured gratitude. For gratitude offered in this particular and deliberate manner signals clearly to the universe that the matter is already considered fully resolved and complete. Leonard Fitch spoke his own decrees sincerely enough each evening, but then anxiously awaited outward proof before ever allowing himself any genuine gratitude in return, unknowingly undermining, through this very anxious waiting, the true authority of his own carefully and sincerely spoken words. Consider closing your own decrees with genuine gratitude rather than anxious waiting, following the careful pattern Winifred so faithfully established for herself over time. Practice. Tonight, offer a brief gratitude exercise to close your own royal decree, speaking your thanks as though the entire matter were already, simply, settled. Chapter 20. Waking each morning as royalty. Beatrice Langford discovered that the particular tone in which she greeted her very first waking thought each morning, hurried and rather apologetic, or calm and genuinely assured, seemed to set the tone in which the entire universe addressed her for the whole of the day that inevitably followed it. The manner of greeting each new morning determines the tone in which the universe will continue addressing the reader throughout the whole of that day, so that this first waking moment genuinely deserves the very same royal attention given so carefully to the evening's closing decree. Roscoe Bellamy woke each and every morning, already muttering his usual complaints before his own feet had even touched the floor beside his bed, undoing in mere moments the careful royal tone his nightly practice had labored so faithfully to build the evening before. Consider how you typically greet your own first waking moment each morning, and what tone you may now wish to deliberately choose instead, following Beatrice's careful and considered example. Practice. To close this second part of your journey, greet your first waking thought tomorrow morning in the calm, assured tone of royalty before any other thought is permitted to intrude. Act 3. Living as one who speaks the code. Chapter 21. The first signs the code is working. Silas Merriweather began noticing, in the weeks following his own first royal decrees, that others around him seemed to treat him with a new and rather unexplained deference he could not immediately account for, though he very nearly dismissed this shift as mere coincidence at first, unwilling to credit his own private and unspoken practice with any real and tangible effect on the world around him. Small shifts in how others respond to us, easily overlooked at first glance if one is not paying careful attention, are often the earliest and most reliable proof that one's new and cultivated voice has begun to quietly reign over one's own circumstances, however subtle that early proof may initially appear to be. Ophelia Rundgren noticed quite similar small shifts occurring in her own life around this same time, but waved each one away as unimportant and entirely unrelated to her own practice, and so failed to nourish the very confidence that would otherwise have carried her own practice considerably further along its promising path. Consider what small shifts in others' responses you may have already noticed, since beginning this practice yourself, shifts you may have been too quick to dismiss, as Ophelia so consistently did. Practice. Tonight, note one small shift in how others have responded to you since you began your own royal voice practice, however minor it may at first appear. Chapter 22. Becoming the person whose word carries weight. Horace Pemberley, a struggling grocer of otherwise unremarkable standing, stopped demanding respect from those around him, and instead began quietly cultivating the calm, assured bearing of one whose word simply and naturally carries genuine weight, noticing others beginning to defer to him without any demand whatsoever being made on his part. Lasting authority is never truly won by demanding respect outwardly, however forcefully or however insistently the demand might happen to be made, but is instead quietly and patiently built by becoming, through consistent and sincere inner practice, the kind of person whose word naturally carries genuine weight wherever it happens to be spoken. Prudence Alderman continued, demanding respect loudly and rather insistently from those around her, making her expectations known at every opportunity, and found this constant demand met, again and again, with quiet resistance rather than the deference she so desperately and openly sought. Consider cultivating quiet inner authority rather than outward demand, following the patient pattern Horace so carefully established for himself over time. Practice. Tonight, identify one small way to cultivate quiet, assured authority today, and practice it deliberately in some small interaction. Chapter 23. When the Servant's Voice Returns. Eugene Halloway, well along in his own sincere practice by this point, was genuinely startled one particularly difficult week to find his old, apologetic servant's voice rising up again within him as strongly as it had ever been, particularly under the stress and unexpected pressure of circumstances he had not anticipated. Even a well-practiced and thoroughly cultivated royal voice may briefly slip back into old and familiar servile patterns under sufficient stress, and this is not genuine failure, however discouraging it may certainly feel in the immediate moment of its return, but rather a natural and entirely passing occurrence to be met calmly, rather than with any real alarm or fear. Henrietta Coswell mistook this same brief and temporary return as certain proof that all her sincere practice had failed entirely, and abandoned her own royal voice altogether in genuine and rather premature discouragement, precisely at the moment when continued and patient practice would have carried her safely through to the other side. Recognize the brief return of the servant's voice as entirely ordinary, should it ever arise again within your own practice, rather than as any genuine and lasting defeat. Practice. Tonight, practice a brief calming exercise for the moment the old servant's voice briefly resurfaces under stress, returning gently to your chosen royal tone. Chapter 24. The Patience of a True Reign. An old shipwright named Barnabas Cole understood, from a long lifetime spent among his timbers and his careful tools, that a true and genuinely lasting vessel cannot ever be built in a single hurried season. However eager the waiting merchant might understandably become in the meantime while he waited, a true reign, much like a well-built and carefully constructed vessel, is constructed steadily and patiently, over considerable time through consistent daily practice, not simply declared once in a passing moment of great enthusiasm, and then expected to rule entirely unattended for the whole rest of one's life without any further tending whatsoever. Young Dorothea Linwood spoke a single, powerful, and sincere decree with great enthusiasm one particular evening, and then abandoned her practice entirely thereafter, expecting that single decree to govern her whole life indefinitely, without any further attention required on her part at all. Consider your own genuine commitment to ongoing and continued practice, rather than resting entirely on a single decree alone, however sincerely and however powerfully that first decree may have originally been spoken. Practice. Tonight, offer yourself a brief reminder affirming your own ongoing commitment to your daily royal practice, going forward from this evening. Chapter 25. Guarding your court from foreign voices. Josephine Kavanagh noticed that after spending an entire evening among critical and rather discouraging company, her own inner voice grew noticeably smaller and considerably more doubtful for several days afterward, as though some foreign influence had crept quietly into her own private throne room quite uninvited. The opinions and the words of others must be carefully and deliberately filtered before ever being allowed any real influence over one's own private decrees, for careless and unguarded exposure to foreign voices can quietly undo even well-established and long-practiced royal habit built up over considerable time. Bartholomew Rhys surrounded himself constantly, and rather carelessly, with critical company of every kind, absorbing their many doubts as though they were entirely his own private thoughts, and found his own royal voice weakening considerably the longer he remained willingly in their discouraging presence. Consider whose voices you may currently be allowing too freely into your own inner court, and what careful filtering might now genuinely be required of you. Practice. Tonight, identify one foreign voice that you will consciously and deliberately filter before it ever reaches your own private decrees. Chapter 26. The Code in Relationships and Opportunity. Frederick Lansing noticed that as his own royal voice grew steadily stronger through consistent and sincere daily practice, favorable people and unexpected opportunities alike began approaching him with a new and rather unforced ease he had never once before experienced in the whole of his life. The very same royal voice shaping one's private inner world also shapes, quite naturally, how favorably others and opportunity alike respond outwardly, for the underlying tone carried quietly within any given person is rarely as hidden from others as that person themselves might assume it to be. Agatha Winslow continued speaking to herself in old, small, and diminishing terms, even while outwardly seeking new opportunity with considerable and sincere effort on her part, and found these particular opportunities remaining curiously and persistently limited, despite her genuine and sincere outward striving toward them. Consider how your own inner tone may already be quietly shaping the opportunities and the relationships that approach you in your own life, whether or not you have yet noticed this particular connection. Practice. Tonight, extend your own royal decree to include one relationship or one opportunity beyond your usual and habitual focus. Chapter 27. When a decree seems to fail. Aloysius Grant spoke a confident and sincere decree regarding a promising venture he had staked considerable hope upon, only to watch that same venture collapse entirely and rather suddenly, leaving him deeply and genuinely discouraged until he discovered, some months later, that its very collapse had quietly redirected him toward a far greater opportunity that his original decree had never once anticipated or imagined. An apparently failed decree is very often quietly working toward a considerably better outcome than the one first imagined by the one who spoke it, and outward and visible failure does not necessarily indicate any true failure of the code itself, however it may certainly appear in the discouraged moment of its initial arrival. Beatrice Noloth resented her own apparently failed decree so completely and so thoroughly that she abandoned her royal practice altogether in genuine bitterness, never once discovering what greater and more fortunate redirection it may have quietly been offering her all along. Consider a past apparent failure of your own, and what genuinely greater outcome it may have quietly been working toward all this time, however painful it felt to you originally. Practice. Tonight, reflect gently on one past apparent failure of your own, and search patiently for the greater outcome that may lie hidden within it. Chapter 28. Those who spoke the code before you. An old harbor pilot named Ezra Thornbury possessed a quiet and genuinely unshakable confidence that others around him attributed simply to good fortune or natural temperament, though he privately maintained a lifelong and unspoken habit of speaking to himself each and every morning exactly as a king addressing his own assembled court. Quiet figures throughout the whole span of history have carried themselves with this same unspoken royal authority, having discovered some private version of this same code through their own personal and largely unrecorded practice, leaving faint traces of it behind in old letters and family memory for those willing to look closely enough to find them. A young descendant, Charlotte Thornbury, discovered her ancestor's private journal many years after his passing and recognized, with genuine and quiet astonishment, the very same practices she had only just recently learned herself, recorded there faithfully in his own careful hand many decades before her own birth into the world. Consider what quiet royal bearing may have existed, entirely unrecognized until now, somewhere within your own family's history. Practice. Reflect briefly this evening on one such figure of quiet authority from your own life or your own family lineage. Chapter 29. Teaching another to find their voice. Clementine Marsh gently and patiently helped a discouraged friend begin speaking to herself in a calmer and more genuinely assured tone, and found her own royal voice growing steadier and considerably more convincing as she carefully guided her friend toward this same important discovery. Helping another person discover their own royal voice for themselves deepens quite considerably the strength and the certainty of the teacher's own ongoing practice, for what is shared with real sincerity becomes, through the very act of sharing it, more firmly rooted within the one who does the sharing. Ambrose Fenwick kept his own royal practice entirely and jealously private, never once helping another person discover it for themselves, and found his own progress growing strangely and rather inexplicably stagnant as a direct result of this quiet and persistent withholding. Consider whether there is someone in your own life you might gently help discover their own royal voice, offering them what has been so generously offered to you. Practice. Identify one person with whom you might gently share a single teaching from this book, offered simply and sincerely in your own words. Chapter 30. The Rain That Requires No More Words. An aged Rutherford Blake found that this particular royal manner of self-address had become so deeply and thoroughly natural to him over many long years of faithful practice that his very presence now seemed to command quiet respect and genuine cooperation from circumstance, without any deliberate decree being required of him at all any longer. Once this code is truly learned and genuinely lived over considerable time, it ceases entirely to require any conscious repetition on the part of the one who has learned it, becoming instead the natural and settled rhythm of a sovereign and thoroughly settled mind, so that one's very presence continues to command what once required deliberate and careful words to accomplish. A young seeker, Wilhelmina Foss, visited old Rutherford one quiet afternoon and asked him plainly the secret of his remarkable and quiet authority, only to be told simply and without elaboration that he no longer needs to speak as a king at all, for he has long since ceased, in any meaningful sense, to be anything else. Imagine your own future self, years from this very evening, for whom this quiet reign requires no more effort than simply and naturally being who you have become. Practice. To close this third and final part of your journey, envision your own life, years from now, having lived this code so faithfully and for so long that your very presence alone now speaks it. Epilogue. You now carry a secret code once spoken only by those rare few who lived, in mind if not always in outward title, as genuine royalty, a code that requires no grand gesture whatsoever to maintain, only the quiet and consistent return, night after night and morning after morning, to a calm and sovereign inner voice, spoken faithfully in the private hours no one else will ever hear or witness. Consider for a quiet moment the distance already travelled from that first uncertain and rather startling listening to your own habitual words to this final and settled understanding of command, of tone, and of deliberate decree that you now carry within you. Your own new voice has already begun its quiet work upon the universe around you, whether or not outward and visible proof has yet fully appeared before your waking eyes to confirm it. The universe has been listening this entire time, faithfully and without exception translating whatever voice has been offered to it, and it stands ready now, from this very moment forward, to answer you exactly as it would answer any king who ever lived and spoke with genuine and settled conviction.